Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a Center for Transatlantic Relations SAIS here at Johns Hopkins University to our book launch, Iraqi Kurdistan, A Path Forward. The book that was meant for the wider audience to show a better understanding of a Kurdistan region, its richness, multi-ethnic, multicultural society, an emerging democracy, struggle and reasons why these great people have opted for well-earned self-determination and out on a road to independence. I want to welcome our guest panelists. I'll do very brief remarks, but I particularly would love to thank Bayan Khan, who is with us, knowing that the Kurdistan region in less than 2 weeks will cast the historic vote on independence, and we appreciate her time. We always love to see her and the people from KRG USA, but we understand how busy and stressful these days are for you. So thank you very much for being with us, and rest assured we will walk the road with you post 25th of September and be here for everything that comes after. We're glad and thankful to our partner, Dr. Nahra Zagros, the Vice President of Saran University, who published this book together with us and who flew in from Erbil to be here. And our special thanks to third co-editor, Teja Ivanovic, our CTR fellow, who actually had the biggest payload and burden of putting all these great articles together. I want to thank the KRG mission in the United States. They were really helpful in facilitating people who contributed the chapter so that we can really understand the Kurdistan region in all variety of topics addressed in a publication better. We really appreciate that partnership. I also, in acknowledgement, need to thank Awad Mustafa of the Barzani Charity Foundation, who helped not only by contributing a case study on a humanitarian crisis in the Kurdistan region, but was very helpful in accommodating our fellow Mariette Hagland, who was in Erbil on our behalf, to put these articles, interviews together so that this publication, I think, is a worthy material to read. I hope after 25th of September, the Iraqi Kurdistan region will be inspired in every single way, form, of shape to further on do all what is necessary in this quest that the Kurdistan region has rightly so embarked. And that includes reforms, that includes right for people to have their land, to purchase, to get the collateral loans, to develop the businesses, to further enhance transparency. And if you see in a book, as we've discussed a number of times, even in a very difficult circumstances, the Kurdistan region has done huge successful reforms in spite of the burdens that they endured of fighting the ISIS and harboring over almost 2 million refugees and having really unimaginable bad relationship with Baghdad and serious economic crisis. All this being known, without further ado, I thank all our guests. Thank you all for coming. And Nahra, I'll give you the floor as our distinguished moderator from Saran University here at Johns Hopkins. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And welcome you all to this event, this wonderful event which we are launching this book. It's a joint venture between Saran University and Johns Hopkins University. The book covers wide subjects of contemporary Kurdistan from the viewpoint of politicians, academics, and community leaders. We believe this book it's going to be an important piece of information for anyone who wants to understand contemporary Kurdish politics, especially now when we are nearing to the referendum, and especially now because we know that Kurdish politics and Iraq in general and the Middle East attracts attention of the decision makers here in Washington and elsewhere. So I can see already people lining up for buying the book, and thank you all for that. But anyway, with this launch event, we have these wonderful distinguished speakers today to talk about various issues regarding Iraqi Kurdistan and the future of Iraqi Kurdistan. I thank all of these distinguished speakers which they participated in today's event. My first speaker is Professor Brendan O'Leary. He's a Lauder professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's going to talk about constitutional rights and how KRG's, Kurdistan Regional Government's constitution is compatible with international law. He's also going to talk about the decision which was made yesterday by the Iraqi parliament, which said the Kurdish referendum is unconstitutional, and he's going to argue why their decision is unconstitutional. Professor O'Leary, he is the series editor of National and Ethnic Conflict in the 21st Century. He has been a political and constitutional advisor to the United Nations, the European Union, Kurdistan Regional Government, and also the government of the United Kingdom and Ireland, and the British Labour Party during the Irish peace process. He has written many books and articles about peace building and about peace process, as well as about Iraq and Kurdistan. So, Professor O'Leary.
Thank you very much indeed. You'll notice that I'm dressed in a blue jacket that looks remarkably like that worn by President Erdogan. I want to assure you that I bought it independently of him. I'm delighted if he's influenced by me in any manner, whether it be sartorial or intellectual. We are very shortly to witness a referendum in Kurdistan. One of the false claims made is that this referendum is unconstitutional according to Iraq's constitution. If there are members of the Iraqi government or members of the Iraqi embassy here, let me explain to you what your constitution says. In Article 110, it specifies the exclusive powers of the federal government. This is a very short list. It contains 10 items. Nowhere in that list is it specified that the federal government has exclusive responsibility over referendums and elections. In Article 115 and Article 1212 of the Constitution of Iraq, regional legal supremacy is established. That is to say, wherever a law or policy is enacted that is outside of the exclusive responsibility of the federal government, there regional law prevails. By elementary construction, therefore, Kurdistan has full freedom to conduct referendums and elections under the terms of Iraq's constitution. Moreover, under Article 141 of Iraq's constitution, the Constitution of Iraq recognizes all of Kurdistan's laws since 1992, provided they're not incompatible with the constitution. One of those laws is Kurdistan's law governing referendums and elections, under which this referendum will take place. Therefore, this constitution is lawful under Kurdistan's laws, and it's constitutional under Iraq's laws. The reason it's being held, of course, is because the constitution of Iraq has become a shambles. It is dishonored more than it is honored substantively. In its key provisions, particularly those regarding federalism, the record is one of unadulterated breaking of the provisions. If we start with the normal person's conception of a federation, you will know that in a federation you have a House of the People and you have a House of the States or the regions. Under Article 65 of Iraq's constitution, there was supposed to be such a chamber of the governorates and regions. It hasn't been established. Federation without a second chamber to protect regions and governorates is not a federation. In Article 92(2) of the Constitution, provision was made to establish a federal Supreme Court. That federal Supreme Court would have had the authority to adjudicate on the Constitution. Well, guess what? The law that would have established that federal Supreme Court has not been implemented. Therefore, Iraq is without a federal Supreme Court capable of adjudicating its constitution. No one can properly test the arguments that I'm making. There is a court in Iraq, but it's a leftover court from the transitional period. It has no standing to interpret the constitution according to Iraq's own constitution. So if you have a federation without a second chamber and a federation without a federal Supreme Court, you have no functioning federation. And this is 12 years after the passage of the Constitution in October of 2005, in which I was privileged to advise the Kurdistan regional government. I want to assure you that my speciality is power sharing in deeply divided places. My role was to advise Kurdistan on how to make the Iraqi Federation work in its interests. I am not someone who goes around the world advocating the secession of every small people, though I don't go around the world advocating their repression either. The reason I'm very committed to supporting Kurdistan's bid for independence is that I see all of the work that we collectively did to try and remake Iraq as a federal and democratic constitution has been effectively ruined. The Council of Representatives yesterday passed a resolution apparently claiming that they had the authority to give the Prime Minister Abadi the right to do whatever he liked to prevent a referendum being held in Kurdistan. They have no authority to do that. Under Article 110, there is no provision granted to the Council of Representatives to pass laws governing referendums and elections inside Kurdistan. That is blocked by Kurdistan's rights under 115 and 1212, as I mentioned before, so that they have no standing to do what they propose to do. I've explained why the federal content of the Constitution has effectively been rendered null and void. Let me now persuade you that the key transitional provisions that affected Kurdistan have also, in effect, been rendered null and void. The most infamous of these is Article 140, under which Kurdistan would have had the right to reunify on the basis of referendums with Kirkuk and other disputed territories, after a set of steps had been taken to rectify the major crimes committed by the Ba'ath regime, which included coercive assimilation, extensive gerrymandering, and the manipulation of administrative boundaries to minimize the number of Kurds in the area and to maximize the number of Arabs, particularly from the south. Article 140 was programmatically intended to unwind the illegal Arabization program of Saddam Hussein. The Article 140 specified that by the end of December 2007, everything that was provided for in that act would have been accomplished by the Federal Executive Council. That has not happened. There has been minimal implementation of some of the prerequisites for fully implementing Article 140, but nothing like comprehensive implementation. The federal government, in effect, has deliberately prevented Article 140 from being implemented. That alone renders the constitutional bargain void. I want to emphasize that the Constitution of Iraq was a voluntary union. For those of you who are not persuaded by that, look at the first page. It defines, in the preface, the Constitution as a voluntary union of land and people. Who was it a voluntary union of? It was a voluntary union of Kurdistan, which had been a de facto independent state since 1992, and Iraq. In effect, Kurdistan was agreeing to re-enter Iraq on the terms of the federal bargain specified in the Constitution. And that Constitution was intended to protect Kurdistan's existing rights, but to share power in a very limited set of domains. All of the power-sharing provisions have, in effect, been violated. Initially, there was some hope that the presidency would act as a collective body on the part of Iraq as a whole. The presidency no longer has any significant power. It no longer represents the three communities. It no longer has any veto capacity. All power at federal executive level has been concentrated in the hands of successive prime ministers. who do not respect the provisions related to the Council of Ministers, have failed to pass laws that would have required the Council of Ministers to be collegial. They passed no bylaws governing their own terms. The power-sharing provisions at the centre that would be necessary to make any voluntary union work have not applied, and they have been deliberately and systematically abused. Now, you could make the excuse that the Iraqi government has faced extreme circumstances, that it's been threatened by constant insurrection and civil war. The problem with such an excuse is that the Baghdad authorities have been as much a cause of those conflicts as they have been responsible for trying to manage them. The way that they have treated the Sunni Arab community, as well as Kurds, as well as other minorities, has partly been a recipe for revolt and insurrection. Kurdistan was very patient. Kurdistan planned to hold the referendum to secede from Iraq in 2014. What stopped it was the success of ISIS in western Iraq, the flight of the federal Iraqi army, and the incursions into Kurdistan itself. You will hear people say, it's not the right time for Kurdistan to have a referendum. I call this the principle of unripe time. The principle of unripe time is that it is not right to do today what it is correct to do today, because it will be right to do it sometime at some convenient juncture in the future. That is what everybody is saying to the Kurds right now. It is what the US government is saying, it's what the State Department is saying, it's what the Pentagon is saying, it's what the EU is saying, it's what the United Nations are saying. It's not the right time. They have conceded the principle that Kurdistan has a right to have a referendum to become independent of Iraq. They're just saying, please don't do it now. Well, Kurdistan has a very long experience of governments telling it that it's not the right time. I know from my own limited knowledge of the region that I can count occasions in 1961, 1966, 1970, 1974, 2004, 2005, 2011. All of these are occasions in which people have encouraged the Kurds not to insist on their rights at this particular time. That's what's different about this moment. We are less than 2 weeks away from the conduct of the referendum. And that referendum, I think, will decisively communicate to the region, to the international community, to the great powers, that Kurdistan has no reason to believe that Iraq could ever fulfill the constitutional obligations of 2005. Together with my colleagues, we've counted the number of articles in Iraq's constitution that have been violated. They number 65 out of 144. 55 out of 144. 67 have either been violated or legislation has been failed to pass to implement key constitutional provisions. That means nearly half of the constitutional provisions in one way or another have either been violated or they have failed to be fulfilled. And I haven't even got to oil and gas yet. And Mr. Chairman, if you'll forgive me, I'll say a few words about that as well. The Constitution was a bargain about natural resources. Both Kurds and key Shia Arabs, particularly in the Iski party, that subsequently became much weaker, but was a central maker of the Constitution with Kurdistan, both of them agreed that the central problem of Iraq had been centralizing tyranny. And that centralizing tyranny had been based ethnically on Sunni Arabs, and it had been based on the claim to exclusive ownership of oil and gas by the central authorities in Baghdad. The Constitution of Iraq of 2005 therefore carefully excludes the federal government from any ownership or exclusive control rights over natural resources. Again, I emphasize, if there's anybody from the Iraqi embassy, read Article 110 of the Constitution of Iraq. You will see that nowhere in that list is any reference to the ownership of oil and gas by the federal authorities. The next article, 111, the one immediately afterwards, says that ownership is vested in all the Iraqi people in all the regions and governorates. It nowhere says it is owned by the federal government. The obvious meaning of that is that this is a provision vesting ownership regionally and in terms of governorates. It can also be interpreted to mean that there is a ban on privatization. What it can never be interpreted to mean is that the federal government has exclusive ownership over natural gas and oil and petroleum reserves. This was not an accident. This was the deliberate design of the Kurdish and Shiite Arab negotiators. They set up provisions to share revenues from existing oil fields until such time as they would be exhausted. And they, in effect, gave rights of development and exploitation to any region or governorate. The idea, therefore, was to federalize power over natural resources, to make consistent the decentralization of power with the decentralization of oil and gas resources. Instead, what we have today is a renewed tyranny, a Shiite majoritarian tyranny, in which they apply Saddam's laws as if the Constitution had never been passed. The Constitution deliberately and carefully renders void any laws from the previous era that's inconsistent with the Constitution. Kurdistan tried to make the arrangements of 2005 work. It offered to share its rights over oil and gas and the revenues thereof on exactly the same basis as oil and gas would be shared from previously exploited fields. That offer was not taken up. Instead, successive Iraqi governments have tried to prevent the Kurds from developing their own resources. Developing their own resources would be key to cementing their autonomy and freedom. So what we have is a picture of a sustained new tyranny in which the Shiite majority has deliberately broken all of the federalizing possibilities in the Constitution, including those over Iraq's key economic resource. They deliberately stopped other parts of Iraq from forming regions like regions with the same powers as Kurdistan. That had been another idea of the Kurdish and Shiite Arab negotiators. They wanted to make sure that to make the federation work, there would be one more entity at least that was like Kurdistan. Federations don't work if there's only 2 units. You need to have a multiplicity of units, so you get the division of power and the coalition building that can make a federation work. 6 governorates have tried either to form regions out of governorates or to merge with one another to form regions. In every instance, they've been blocked by the federal government. In one of the most ridiculous moments, Maliki claimed that they couldn't do it because the passage of Article 140, the article dealing with the disputed territories, had not been dealt with. In other words, he pled the deliberate failure to implement one article in the Constitution as an excuse for not implementing another. I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, I could go on, but I won't. I will come to an end. This Constitution is going to receive its verdict from the people of Kurdistan very shortly. They voted inside the 3 governorates in 2005. They voted in the governorate of Kirkuk in favor of the Constitution in 2005. They voted in the disputed territories in favor of the Constitution in 2005. They know that the appropriate way to withdraw their consent to that Constitution is by the same process, by a referendum. Unambiguously, that referendum will bind the leaders of the Kurdistan regional government. There will be room for negotiation, by contrast, over the future status of the disputed territories. But at least it will be very clear what the popular preferences are in those zones. So, to conclude, Kurdistan's freedom has been a long time coming. In my view, the final break will occur in a couple of weeks' time, And thereafter, you must anticipate protracted negotiations. Not infinitely protracted, but protracted negotiations. But the message will be an irreversible one. Kurdistan will have voted freely and democratically before the world to leave the voluntary union of 2005. And it will have explained to the world that it tried to make Iraq work, but Iraq can't work for Kurds. It's more dangerous for Kurds to stay in Iraq than to leave it, and that's the decision they will be making. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting, very insightful. And interestingly, the decision by the Iraqi parliament yesterday to not recognize Kurdish referendum and labeling it as unconstitutional, we wonder under what article of the constitution did the Iraqi government start sending Kurdish budget around 4 years ago. Anyway, my next speaker is Eric Brown, who is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. His areas of expertise include East Asia and the Pacific, terrorism and radical ideologies, Middle East and North Africa. He's one of the editors of the International Review of Current Trends in Islamic Ideology. He has written for the American Interest, the Wall Street Journal, China Heritage Quarterly, and many more. Recently, he completed 2 studies on Iraqi Kurdistan and the future of Middle East. Eric Brown will be talking about strategic trends in the Middle East and also Iraqi Kurdistan. Eric.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me here. I'm pleased to be here, and I also want to congratulate the editors and the contributors to the new volume, because while I've only had a chance to look at the contents and review some of the articles, I think that it really does help set the agenda for what I hope will sort of set the pace of what's to come. And I think that the real possibility of the referendum is that it will begin a conversation that I think we've wasted a lot of time in not having so far, and that is how to go about advancing the institutions, the political institutions, the economic institutions, among other things, within Kurdistan, which will enable the Kurds to maintain their sovereignty in the middle of a region in which governance has effectively, in many parts, collapsed. I believe that the U.S. has a strategic interest in seeing Kurdistan develop greater capacity for self-government. I don't say independent statehood, although I'm for that as well. But I think in some respects, the independence movement puts the question of statehood, it's sort of putting the cart before the horse. I do think that the referendum and it's important to demonstrate the widespread political will within Kurdistan, and that this should help to generate support across the region for a deeper reflection on the kinds of political institutions and unity which is required to sustain independence. I do believe that the sort of fiction of one Iraq, of a united Iraq, has helped to slow down and prevent the United States and the Friends of Kurdistan from thinking in a real strategic fashion about the kinds of investments that need to be made in the northeastern part of Iraq for the Kurds there to be able to sustain their independence. I recall back in 2009, I spoke to a Sunni Arab tribal leader, one of the gentlemen who we had worked, who our US military had worked with in order to successfully prosecute the surge. And he had told me 3 things. He told me, number one, he said Al-Qaeda was coming back. Islamic State was what he was referring to. Al-Qaeda was reconstituting itself. Secondly, he said, the government in Baghdad is tyrannizing over us, and it's just getting worse. And thirdly, I asked him, well, what is it that you want? What is it that you want that you can provide your people so that they can have the security that they require? And he said, we want what the Kurds have. In other words, the sort of state building and the processes of political development which were going on in Kurdistan had become a model for other communities throughout the Greater Levant. And I think at that time, in order, if Iraqi federalism was to be saved, we had an actual strategic interest in helping to beef up that model, to bolster it, to support it. As it happens, we failed at that. Now, I'm going to remain agnostic about whether or not federalism is possible anymore. I have my own sympathies. I actually think Iraqi federalism had been tried and that it's no longer possible going forward. But I do think that if some kind of federalism is possible, the only way in which it can be obtained is if some sort of favorable balance of power is created within Iraq. And that should have meant that we should have been making some real investments in Kurdistan previously, and as well as now, in military capability, political capability, among other things, so that the Kurds themselves would have been more effectively able to represent and to defend their own interests and their own territory with respect to Baghdad. I say this now because I also think that a lot has changed. The political order across the Greater Levant, from which I mean the Eastern Mediterranean of Syria, straight into the western provinces of Iran, has collapsed in many places, and certainly in other places it's very, very brittle. A lot of people have looked at this as a problem of how do you go about sort of reconstituting the old order. But I think that there's a deeper problem within the region, and that is the political order itself there is not just simply broken, but it's reorganizing itself. There's a diversity of trends that are now vying and contesting for shaping the future of that order. As we know, as nation states have begun to melt away, it's revealed a much older map that's defined by religion, the disputes between religions, by tribe, by ethnicity. This is the basis of the sort of politics of the Greater Levant right now. The region is also reorganizing itself because of demographic trends. Everywhere you go, whether it's in Turkey or in Iraq or in Syria, people will admit that they understand that their politics are being changed forever by the fact that there is a sort of Kurdish vitality. We've collected data from the Turkish government, what data we can gather from the Iranians and from other sources in the region. And you see that fertility rates among ethnic Kurdish households in all the 4 different corners of Kurdistan are actually much higher than the fertility rates amongst the core populations of the ruling regimes in the Middle East. That raises a very interesting question. Now, there are no straight line projections in demography, just like in nature, but it's quite possible that within the next 20 years, there will be upwards of 60 million people who had been born in Kurdish-speaking households living in the heartland of Southwest Asia. This population is bringing enormous power to bear on what's left of what remains of the state-based order, the nation state-based order. If the ruling regimes of the region cannot absorb this population, then it will break under these pressures. So far, I would like to think that there are enlightened governments in the region that will take an active interest in absorbing this population and making them part of their own polities. But so far, up until relatively recently, the only country in the region which I thought might have an enlightened interest in this was the Turkish one. But relatively recently, certainly in the last few years, I think Erdogan has revealed a certain tendency, both within his domestic polity and also with respect to other polities across the Greater Levant, that has demonstrated that, no, in fact, he's interested in establishing proxies and dependencies and subordinating populations to his own rule. I think that in light of this political reordering that's going on here, the United States does have an interest in finding positions of self-sustaining strength with which we can cooperate to pursue a variety of strategic and political trends. And for that reason, I do think that the United States has a real interest in supporting this referendum and supporting the Kurds in their quest for statehood. I want to take a step back and say that the original argument for Kurdish self-government, I think, goes back to 1692, among other things. It was written down in an epic poem, the Memudzin, written by the Kurdish author Ahmad Khani. It tells of the tragic story of two lovers from different tribes who were prevented from being together in life as well as in death. And after tribal feuds leads to Mem's murder, Zin dies of grief at his graveside and is buried next to him. Vendetta-driven tribesmen then hunt down Mem's murderer and leaves his corpse to rot between the graves of the two lovers. And as the body between the two graves rots, a plant rises from it with thorny branches and roots which plunge deep into the earth, thereby perpetuating the separation of Mem and Zin even in death. Now, the story itself, a lot of folks will note a sort of similarity between Romeo and Juliet, and I think actually the comparison is a great subject for a doctoral dissertation. But it's also in the Mem and Zin a really fascinating reflection on the consequences, or rather the difficulties of forming political order on the basis of tribal society. And it's also, interestingly enough, a reflection on why the failure to form political order has been so bad for the peoples in the middle. And here let me read a quote, a concluding stanza. Khani writes, "Look, from the Arabs to the Georgians, the Kurds have become like towers. The Turks and the Persians are surrounded by them. The Kurds are on all four corners. Both sides have made the Kurdish people targets for the arrows of fate. That they are said to be the keys to the borders, each tribe forming a formidable bulwark. Whenever the Ottoman Sea and the Tajik Sea flow out and agitate, the Kurds get soaked in blood, separating them like an isthmus." It's an extremely powerful quote, which of course is I think, if you look at the current situation, that the Kurds and the other peoples in the middle of the Levant, as they find themselves in the middle of these clashes of these new imperial projects, which are shaping the region, you notice that the future of the region in some respects oftentimes looks very similar to the past. Now, the best way for the people in the middle to be able to provide for themselves is not to depend on outsiders to provide their security. In fact, I think if you look back at the age of empires prior to the rise of the modern state-based order, the age of empires was actually much better for the Kurds than the modern state-based order had. Now that that modern state-based order, the one from the 20th century, has shown signs of collapse and withering away in certain areas, I'm certainly not sympathetic to it, and we should certainly understand why most Kurds don't really have an interest in seeing it come to be resuscitated either. Now, Khani also warned, there's a deeper reading to the Memudzin, and I just want to mention this. He had also warned that without political unity, the formation of governing institutions was difficult. Why? I mean, what had separated Memudzin? It was the tribal vendettas and the constant feuding between different factions, which had made it very difficult for Mem and Zin ultimately to be together, both in life and in death. And that is the tragedy, if you will, of his poem and the deepest element, I think, of his teaching. So my hope is, going forward, that the referendum will help to clarify why it is it's important, both for the Kurds and for their friends and partners on the outside, to do everything that we can to help build governing institutions that can help reduce the natural heterogeneity and faction in all societies, and help the Kurds maintain political unity in the face of the threats that they face. I think as a practical matter, that means that the United States has to take a very active interest in helping to integrate the Peshmerga militias. I realize that that's going to be a long process, but it's something that there's political support for in Kurdistan, both within the KDP and in the PUK, and it's a process that should have begun a long time ago. I think the United States has a real interest in cross-regional economic integration between KDP-held territories and PUK and Garan-held territories. I think the United States has a real interest in deepening educational exchange and educational institutions within the region. All of these investments, I think, are going to be necessary to help the Kurds continue with their project of state building and to ultimately be able to sustain the independence that they so desire. And I think we should help them with a very clear policy of support for this going forward. With that, I'll stop and thank you.
Thanks very much. And interestingly, the nationalistic discourse in Khani's seminal work, Mamuzin, was talked about, disseminated 100 years before the rise of nationalism ideology, 100 years before the French Revolution. And it's interesting to see how even modern Kurds now relate to what Khani had to say a long time ago. I think we'll have a question and answer afterwards when all our speakers have talked. But before then, I'm going to my last speaker, Bayan Sami Abdurrahman, who is a well-known figure in Kurdish politics, in contemporary Kurdish politics, and also she is the High Representative of Kurdistan Regional Government in the United States, and strengthening ties between Kurdistan and the United States, and also advocating her government's position on cultural, political, security, humanitarian, and economic matters here in the United States. Prior to her appointment to the United States, she was the KRG's High Representative in the United Kingdom. And in 2010, Ms. Rahman was elected as, to the Council of Leadership of the Kurdistan Democratic Party. Before her career in public service, she was a journalist, and she worked as a journalist for 17 years. Now, and I'm sure you will be talking about a referendum and why this referendum is a Kurdish right, and why 100 years ago when the borders were drawn, Kurds were bystanders, but now they don't want to be bystanders in the Middle East.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's difficult to follow Brendan and Eric, but I'll do my best and I'll keep it short. First, I'd like to really commend Soran University and Johns Hopkins SAIS for publishing this book. I'm sure it wasn't easy to get these articles from various people around the world. I think it's a great snapshot of Kurdistan today. It's a very good window into the thinking, the planning, and the status of Kurdistan today. And I would urge all of you to buy a copy and to really enjoy reading it. So I'm really going to answer the question, why should we have the referendum now? As Brendan very clearly articulated, we in Kurdistan invested everything in the new Iraq, the Iraq after 2003. We believed that this would be a federal, democratic, pluralistic Iraq, and that the constitution would be the contract by which all of us would live. I have described 2005, the moment when the majority of the public in Kurdistan and other parts of Iraq voted in favor of the referendum. I described that moment as the moment of peak optimism about the new Iraq. That was the moment when Saddam was defeated, he was out. We had got together with the other stakeholders in Baghdad, and we had together formulated a constitution that protected people's rights, described Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq as partners. Kurdish was one of the 2 official languages in the country, and so on, and all of the other arguments that Brendan has already described so well. Unfortunately, after 2005, we saw an unraveling of that commitment. Brendan has already described the violations, or some of the violations, and some of the breaches of the Constitution, so I won't go into that. But the impact on us in Kurdistan was to make us realize that everything we had thought we were buying into, everything we had thought that we were investing in after 2003 was not what the rest of Iraq was investing in, that we were talking at cross purposes. How many places in Iraq have any Kurdish signposts outside of Kurdistan? How many politicians in Iraq speak Kurdish? You go to Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada has to speak French and English. You go anywhere in Canada, not just Quebec, the signs are in French and English. You go to Wales in Britain, the same. The signs are in Welsh and English. This is just a very simple breach of the Constitution, but for us, our language is part of our identity, it's part of our culture, it's part of our history. This is why it's been banned in different places across the Middle East. So there are so many telltale examples and outright violations of the Constitution until 2014, by which time we had realized that this Iraq that we had signed up to was not workable for us. It may work for others, but it does not work if you are among the people of Kurdistan. And we wanted to have a referendum in 2014, but ISIS came and the idea was set aside. Now we're back. Now we want a referendum. Why? Because it is the right time. We have waited long enough. 2003, Saddam's regime was toppled. 2005, we all voted in a new constitution. In the next decade, we saw that constitution ridden roughshod over. Now it's time for the people of Kurdistan to decide their own fate. Let people vote no if they want. Let people spoil their ballot paper if they want. And let people vote yes if they want. Let people decide. It is our right, just as it is the right of the people of various Arab countries, the people of Canada, the people of the United States, the people of European countries, the people of Scotland. It is our right to have a referendum and to determine our own future. I believe the majority of the people of Kurdistan will vote yes in the referendum, and we will then begin the negotiations with Baghdad. We will open the negotiations with a warm heart and open ideas. We want to be good neighbors with Iraq. It is not in our interest to have an unstable Iraq or to have an unfriendly Iraq. Whether we're part of Iraq or we're next door neighbors to Iraq, we need to have good relations. It's the biggest stake for us is a peaceful Iraq. So we will do our best after the referendum to have peaceful negotiations with Baghdad and to reach a peaceful, amicable settlement on borders, on the division of assets, on debts, on future relations. Some people have even talked about citizens having dual passports because there are so many mixed families and so on. Everything is possible. Everything can be discussed. The important thing for us is the dialogue. We have already tried to begin the dialogue. High-level delegations have been to Baghdad. They have spoken to Prime Minister Abadi, to former prime ministers, to all of the major stakeholders in Baghdad. And we will continue to do that. We're open to dialogue day and night, and we will continue to do that after the referendum. One last point that I would like to make, which is that currently the United States position, along with others, is to try to persuade the Kurdish leadership to postpone the referendum. The question is, why should we postpone? Is there a guarantee that if we hold the referendum in a year's time, that the United States would support the process and that the United States would respect the outcome of the referendum? So far, we haven't had that guarantee from the United States. So respectfully, I say to our friends here in Washington, we listen to you. Of course, the relationship with the United States is very important for us. And we're not happy that we have this disagreement with America. But please, you need to look at it from our point of view. We have come so far. We are 2 weeks away from the referendum. If you want us to delay, you need to give us guarantees. Otherwise, in a year's time, we're holding a referendum again, and the United States is against it once more. We need to have guarantees. As of today, we are going ahead on September 25th, and I urge all of you to support the right of the people of Kurdistan to hold the referendum and to decide their future. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Interestingly, there is a misconception we hear not only in the United States, but also in Europe and Iraq and the Middle East, and that is, this referendum, it's only decided by the Kurdish leadership to provoke Iraq and politicians in the Middle East. They ignore that the Kurdish leadership is under enormous pressure from the public. And patience is running out, and Kurds wants to decide on their fate and their future. Thanks very much for all these distinguished speakers. We had some interesting insight into Kurdish politics, into Iraqi constitution, and why Kurds should have a referendum, and also the future of Iraq and the Middle East. Now I will open the floor for some questions, if you may have, for the speakers. And after that, once we finish, I'll be talking about the book and thank all the people who helped to get this book together. Now, any questions? And okay. Shall I write names and then we will go to? Okay. Who else?
I think
Sorry,
there's
just
a microphone.
let me. Can I write the name, Susan? Just one sec. Sorry. Yeah. Who else? Okay, Susan.
This is just a very simple procedural question. I assume that what steps has the regional government made to get international acceptance of this referendum? For instance, have you hired international election monitors and other things like that?
Thank you. Shall we take the questions and then the answer?
Sure.
Okay. Gentleman from the Iraqi embassy.
Actually, your room is too small, so I think, thank you very much.
I would appreciate if you say your name.
Sure. Hatem Abdelrazak Al-Anbari, Iraqi embassy. Actually, we came here for the book issuance, but since the professor mentioned the Iraqi embassy, I thought it would be necessary to make some comments and questions. And Professor, as you know, the subject matter of the constitutional law is very broad and very broad and controversial sometimes. And in the constitutional law, there's something called contrast of laws. And this is taught in many universities, including this respected university. And in this matter, the contrast of laws, usually there is a...
Do you mean clash of laws?
Exactly, clash of laws or contrast of laws.
That's
usually
governed by
there's
Article 115 and 1212.
Exactly. There is a body, usually it's a Supreme Court, which decides which law is the higher than the other. In this case, it is the Iraqi Supreme Federal Court, which exists.
It does not exist.
It does.
It does not. 92.2 has not been passed. What you have is a leftover court from a previous era. You must really read and understand your own constitution.
Professor, this is your own...
It's evident that you and your government don't understand it.
I do, Professor, and if this is the idea you are stick to, it's up to you. The court exists, and it has issued a couple of jurisdictions and rules over the clash of laws. I want to mention that, since you mentioned the Constitution, the same Constitution that you mentioned says that in Article 1, that Iraq is one federal democratic country. And Article 1 does not mention the word optional, and I would be happy to give you a legal English translation of the Constitution to see where it says that Iraqi unity is an optional one. Second, the same Constitution says that Kurdish is an official language of Iraq, and not like what you mentioned in our last event, that the Iraqi embassy does not recognize Kurdish language. It does, and Dr. Ban knows that the letterhead of all our official memos is in Kurdish and in Arabic. We can continue the whole day talking about the constitutional law, but I believe, and I think you believe too, that it is unfair to say that some articles in a constitution are applicable and they work while ignoring the other articles. Thank you.
Thank you. Laurie?
Kurdistan 24. I want to thank all the panels for those fascinating remarks. And I have a question for Bayan, which is when, you say that when Kurdish officials say to the U.S. government officials, well, we'll postpone it if you give us a guarantee. Could you give us more detail about what their response is and why they don't say, okay, in a year, a year would be a good time from now?
Thank you. And gentleman here. This way.
This question is for Mrs. Rahman or Mr. O'Leary. Can you please address how you would take into consideration the Turkmens in the referendum vote? I believe many of the politicians from the Turkmen government has, they said that they're going to boycott the election, that they're not even going to try to tell them to vote no, they're just going to boycott it. So I just want to know what your opinion is on how you're going to take them into consideration.
Thank you. Okay. Do you have another question? Okay.
Hi, I'm Kara Wilson. I just wanted to ask about how the referendum would impact the Kurdish populations in the other countries, particularly Syria, and I mean, obviously in Iran and Turkey, but I know that at one point the Iraqi government was cooperating quite extensively with Turkey, in part to by ISIS, but what happens with those agreements now if the referendum is passed?
Thank you. I think most of the questions were to the panelists, so who wants to go first is entirely up to you. Yeah?
I'll answer the ones that I think were directed to me. So with regards to the procedures for the referendum, there is it's a commission with a very long-winded name, but it's basically the Commission for Referendums and Elections in Kurdistan. It was created by a law passed by the Kurdistan Parliament some years ago. And this commission is organizing the logistics for the referendum, the ballot boxes, the polling stations, and any organizations that want to send monitors, they can apply online, or if you contact our office, we can direct you to the commission. And definitely we are inviting international observers. We would like as many observers, legitimate international observers, to participate as possible. The legitimacy of the referendum, of course, is very important for us. For the diaspora, the Kurds who live in Europe, in the United States, Canada, they are able to vote electronically. The registration period has already started, ends on September 22nd, and the Kurds abroad can vote on September 23rd. The Kurds, or the people of Kurdistan in Kurdistan, can vote on September the 25th. Some of the other questions, yes, the issue of the Kurdish language, I know that, of course, it is used in places, but as I said, it's not in the same way as, say, Canada or Wales, or those countries where they have two languages. And that is one of the most obvious and open signs that really what the bargain that we struck in the Constitution is not accepted. There are many more, even more serious issues like oil and gas and others. And of course, Article 140 not being implemented. So I was really just giving the language as an example. So the question from Laurie about the discussion on the delaying of the referendum and guarantees. Well, President Barzani has been clear in his discussions with Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, and others as well, that we can't just postpone this referendum without some guarantee that if we postponed, that there would be some guarantee in future that a future referendum would take place on a date, an agreed date, and that the procedure, the process would be recognized and the outcome recognized. Without that, I don't see what we can agree to. I don't see how the people of Kurdistan would accept a delay. We have to present something that's acceptable. So far, I at least have not heard anything. I know that there are still many diplomatic back and forths going on between the US and Baghdad and Erbil. But certainly, whenever I pick up the phone to the leadership in Kurdistan and I talk to a different range of people reflecting generally different political views, as of today, right now, we are still going ahead on September 25th because there's no alternative that's been presented to us with a guarantee. And as I said, it's very difficult now to persuade the Kurdish public when we've been talking about a referendum since at least 2014. If we're going to delay or postpone, there has to be something better on offer. Otherwise, we go ahead. The gentleman who asked about the Turkmen, certainly we take on board the views of the ethnic and religious components that make up Kurdistan and the disputed territories, Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen, Assyrian, the religious minorities, Yazidis, Christians, Kakis. We want Kurdistan today and Kurdistan in the future when it's independent to be a home for everyone. We are not talking about Kurdistan as purely a Kurdish territory, whether it's a region or a state. Kurdistan is for everybody who lives there. And if you look at the delegations that have been going to Baghdad recently, they have included leaders of the main political parties and representatives of some of the minorities. The leadership has also talked about planning for a Kurdish state that has the rights of every component at its heart. And if you look at the draft Kurdistan constitution, we already have a draft constitution. The rights of the minorities and the components are set out and protected. We're in a continuous dialogue, so for us, it's not that we discussed something 5 years ago and the door is closed. Society evolves. The demands of different groups in society evolve all the time. You look at the United States. Maybe 50, 60 years ago, it was about the rights of black people and desegregation and civil rights. Today, the discussion in America is about something else because society has evolved, and we recognize that. We recognize that the demands of different components, whether it's Turkmen, Christians, women, different components have different demands at different times. We are there to listen, and we definitely want to take on board any concerns that they have. Of course, we want the Turkmen to participate in the referendum. They should voice their opinion. That is our view, but it's a free vote. They can choose not to.
As far as I know, the majority of Turkmen leadership are going to vote yes, and they're encouraging their people to vote yes. There is a tiny minority within the Turkmens in Kirkuk, and interestingly, only in the Kirkuk, not Turkmens in Erbil and elsewhere. They are not in favor of the referendum.
Thank you very much for all the questions. I would like to apologize to the member from the Iraqi embassy for interrupting him. The reason I interrupted him is I'm impatient with fake facts. And fake facts damage good discourse. The preface to the Constitution of Iraq in English, according to the official Iraqi version, refers to the adherence to this constitution preserves for Iraq its free union of people, of land, and of sovereignty. free union, a voluntary union. A voluntary union is a contract, and it is widely understood in international and constitutional law, about which I have some competence, that if a voluntary union is entered into and one party breaches it substantially, the other has no obligation to sustain the contract. Point one. Point two, Article 92, point two, created a mechanism for establishing the Federal Supreme Court. It requires the passage of a law by the Federal Council of Representatives. A two-thirds majority must pass that law. That law has not been passed. You do not have the Federal Iraqi Supreme Court warranted by this constitution. You have a leftover court from a previous time, which has no constitutional standing. If the parties choose to agree to respect it, all of them, then it might matter. They don't, and they have good reasons not to respect that transitional court. You raised the question of a clash of laws. There can only be a clash of laws when there are rival laws. There is no federal Iraqi law outlawing referendums. Therefore, there's no clash of laws. Kurdistan has a law enabling it to conduct referendums. Under Article 141 of Iraq's constitution, that is protected. It's not inconsistent with Iraq's constitution. So there is nothing unlawful and unconstitutional about Kurdistan holding a referendum. There is everything unlawful and unconstitutional with the federal Iraqi government claiming to have some power which it does not have in this constitution to block the referendum. It is another example of its lawless disrespect for federal provisions and its own constitution. This is tragic. Fake facts against previously clearly established legal agreements. It's deeply unfortunate. That accounts for my impatience. Kurdistan's referendum is lawful. Iraq's efforts to prevent it are unlawful. The Turkmen. I have had the privilege of meeting many Turkmen communities in my time both in Kurdistan and in the disputed territories. They are a divided people. Some are Shia, some are Sunni. Some are pro-Baghdad parties, some are pro-Tehran, some are pro-Ankara. The overwhelming majority that I have met inside the Kurdistan region believe that life is much better for Turkmen, that their rights, particularly their linguistic rights, and their rights to educate their own children in their own language are better protected inside Kurdistan than they are outside of it. That is the general pattern of all minorities in Iraq, not just Turkmen. You only have to ask yourself a very simple question. Where do the minorities go in Iraq if they flee from violence or persecution? They don't go to Basra. They don't go to Baghdad. They don't go to Salahuddin. They go to Kurdistan. If they can't get out of the country, they go to Kurdistan. They go there because they know that they will be respected. They won't face either linguistic or religious or any ethnic persecution. Now, you're right to be concerned about the fate of Turkmen. Like any small minority, when the bigger groups around them compete and contest, smaller minorities can sometimes suffer very badly. Therefore, it's crucial for Turkmen to play a role in advocating for their rights under the new constitutional regime that will apply in an independent Kurdistan. Bayan referred to the draft constitution. That draft was drafted on the assumption that Kurdistan would remain part of Iraq. Because that's not going to be the future, that constitution will have to be revisited. And I played a role in helping draft the provisions on minorities, and I would expect that those would need to be revised in the circumstances of an independent Kurdistan. I can assure you that I would not work for the Kurdistan regional government if I didn't believe that it was committed to the protection of nationalities, ethnicities, and religions different from the core majority. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Eric, do you have anything?
There was a question about the impact of the referendum on other.
Yeah, fair.
I thought that
yeah,
might be.
that is a good question. And all right, the reality is, of course, I'm sorry that the person who had asked the question has left, but the reality, of course, is that these are very different polities. Nonetheless, ethnic Kurds in Turkey and in Syria and Iran have taken a real active interest in developments within Iraqi Kurdistan and would like to see the Kurds in Iraq succeed. Succeed at independence, continue to govern themselves, continue to be a model of responsible government throughout the region. That, of course, wouldn't be such a problem for the wider region if the ruling regimes in Tehran and in Turkey offered appealing government for their Kurdish population. As of right now, I think it's fair to say that they don't, which is one of the reasons why Tehran especially, I think, has made a lot of statements and certainly taken a lot of actions which have indicated that it more is interested in subverting or ruining Kurdish self-rule in Iraq, largely because they haven't demonstrated the capacity to provide good, responsible government for their Kurds and the largely majority Kurdish provinces of Iran. Because of that, that's one of the reasons why I had indicated earlier that I think that Kurdish unity is absolutely vital. It's a national security requirement for the region. That means dealing with the political crisis. That means joint Peshmerga forces. That means a real capacity to be able to cooperate, not just in the face of a threat, but be able to sustain unity even when that threat isn't there. That's absolutely vital for Kurdish statehood going forward, particularly because if Iran were to make an effort to undermine Kurdish political sovereignty, I don't believe it's necessarily going to do it directly. It's going to do it indirectly through subversion, through playing with disputes that take place amongst the Kurds, through supporting one faction against another. And unfortunately, that has been the pattern which has spoiled Kurdish state building in the past. And that's why I think Kurdish unity is absolutely a requirement if Kurdish state building in this period is going to succeed. And that needs to be a priority going forward.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid, Kag Ibrahim, we don't have time. Just want to thank all the panelists and all of you for attending this session today. And we are glad that we have this book out. And for that, I would like to thank a few people and a few institutions who helped to get this one together, namely the Ministry of Higher Education of KRG, who continuously helped financially helped to get this book together. And also the KRG office here in Washington, the Barzani charity, especially Kag Awad and Kag Musa, but also I thank Johns Hopkins University and CTR within SAIS for helping to get this book together. Like Bayan Khat said, this is a snapshot, captions of modern politics, culture, history, geography of Kurdistan. It's a great insight for anyone who wants to understand contemporary issues that Kurdish people and the peoples of Iraq are facing today. I would like to thank all of you again for attending this session and thank anyone who is interested to get a copy of this book. Once again, thank you very much, all of you, on behalf of Soran University and Johns Hopkins.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you again. Thank you.